Hello and welcome to week 9 and chapter 9 in behavior management. And here we take on the concept of choice. Now, an interesting historical quality about the ABC contingency theory or operant conditioning from Skinner's point of view is that the individual, the black box that we would, that represents philosophically the brain within the ABC model, meaning we don't have to know what's going on in the black box. We just manipulate A's and C's, really precludes the whole notion of free will. In fact, some of the advances in psychology that came out after that were in opposition to both the prevailing philosophies of Freud, who felt that personality was largely driven by unconscious motives that we have, again, no control or choice over. And then behaviorism coming along saying it's all about, external influences on us. The fact that we have free will to make choices, even within those circumstances, is really the driving force behind the humanist movement within psychology. Now, every one of these theories, as you're studying psychology, you're going to understand is simply a different lens to look at situations and understand them. And essentially, we use the best one for the circumstances that we're in. Now, because we're not stuck in that mentality of, just manipulating A's and C's and not worrying about the individual, we can actually include now in the ABC contingency theory the free will and choice of the person that's there. Now, we understand from personality psychology, cognitive psychology, social psychology, that the capacity for us to make choices, for us to look at our circumstances, evaluate which ones are most relevant, what we believe in, and then make a choice as to the next step that we're going to take is a profoundly important and powerful part of our psychology and the lived experience. I mean, the rhetoric in our country, in the United States, of freedom is essentially the ability to evaluate information yourself, make choices, that there's no outside forces making us do particular things and whatnot. And although those are in fact realities, and there are forces around us that impact us, what we value most is the ability for us to choose our own path. So within the ABC contingency theory, there are opportunities in which we can have the individual upon whom we are implementing this plan make choices. We see the value of this in many, many ways. First and foremost, we validate the idea that free will is important. But I'm going to use the word agency. Agency is the perception by which we have the ability to make choices and set the direction and the course of our lives. So when we express agency is when we are making decisions and doing those. When we're in circumstances where we're being controlled and don't have the ability to express agency, it is largely unpleasant, you know. So we have the ability, so there's that component, just justifying the fact that we like to have agency and we prefer to operate that way. In addition, when an individual upon whom a behavior plan is going to be placed, an ABC contingency plan, is given the opportunity, not just once, but twice, both in the design and the implementation of the plan, to make choices, the individual is more likely to have buy-in, meaning they feel agency in the creation of the plan and the implementation of the plan. This is a win-win for them. The plan, they know what's going on. There's nothing hidden. This is not although it can be done that way, we do not necessarily, particularly with individuals who are able to understand the behavior management plan they're on, we're right up front. There's no trick. There's no, oh, when this happens, I'm going to be watching and I'll give you the rewards. And, you're going to be almost like if you've watched The Big Bang, series, there was an episode in which Sheldon was giving candy to Penny every time she said something that he liked, and playing like nobody knew what was going on. That's not behavior management. That's manipulation. Basically, we bypass that. We tell everybody what's going on, get them involved in the creation of the plan. We get buy-in on both sides, and basically, within the interaction between the person implementing the plan, who's in charge of the A's and C's, and the person upon whom the plan is being implemented on, in charge of the B's, we now add a third component. It is me and that person negotiating the agreement that is spelled out in the behavior plan. It's the behavior plan that has power, not me. I'm not, as the person in charge of the delivery of reinforcers or punishments, I am equally bound by the specifics of the plan. So we can move some of the emotional component away from the individual who's implementing the plan, to the, I don't know, this is what we agreed to do. I'm going to hold up my end, you hold up your end. This is until we agree to make a change. This is what we're going to go by. It can actually stifle a lot of arguments that sort of come up when somebody might forget they're on a plan, and here you are living up to your end about not giving a reinforcer unless the person has performed the behavior. You can then turn to the plan and say, this is what we agreed on. So we want individuals to be able to make choices at almost every stage of the game here. A person who doesn't have the ability to make choices can learn to be helpless. We talk about learned helplessness. Talk about the helplessness that some people with disabilities experience when the medical community or the care community begins to take over decisions with their best interest in mind, but yet there is a negative component to that where the individual can become essentially disenfranchised from the decision-making process. And in its most nefarious way, an individual who is in the mental health system, let's say, who has simply been going along with what their workers and case managers have been saying, doesn't really necessarily own the consequences of those decisions. Sometimes what we as caregivers think is the best thing to go, we might advise somebody, they go along with it, and they can say, and if it doesn't work out, they can say, well, I didn't do this, you told me to do it. It's very important for workers to be able to understand, and when you're working with anybody, to understand that a lot of this, how much of this you have to attribute to the agency of the individual that is on the plan. In mental health, it was very, very important. When I was working as a case manager, when I would work on goals, I would just, even down to the point of writing out the goals in the language that the individual is saying it, even though for billing purpose somewhere else I had to write it out a little different in order to get catchwords that indicated services and whatnot that will be billable somewhere in the documentation of that relationship with the client is their words. Just that alone says, this was your goal. This is your goal in each step, working through as much as you possibly can to do that. What this brings up, though, is the risk of making bad choices. And this class is not focused necessarily on what to do when somebody's making bad choices, other than they don't get their reinforcer or they get their punishment, and certainly if you choose to take that drink, you know what's going to happen, that, or this is what is most likely to happen. We can illuminate the consequences of somebody's actions, but there's always that balance at which where we're interested in individuals behaving in a particular way that we may feel is best for them, and we have to balance that with the effect that taking over has on their sense of agency, which is lifelong. And I have personally worked with individuals who have been systematically taught that they do not have agency. And those individuals lack the capacity to be able to make informed choices. That skill set of being able to evaluate what's best for you, and even consulting with people around them and stuff. I've known individuals that simply say, "You tell me what to do." Might not have said it overtly, but figuratively telling people, "Just tell me what to do and I'll do it." Now, that said, I want to show you in the course book, there's an example of when we think about the design of the construction, let's say, of an ABC plan, we can introduce choices in the A's, the B's, and the C's, and any combination of those. The example that I give in the course book kind of goes to the nth degree. It gives a bunch of choices for the A's, a bunch of choices for the B's, and a bunch of choices for the C's. And you can see this one plan sort of addressing all of the different behaviors. So if we look at this in the course book, here we have the antecedent, either in the morning or after dinner. Up to you. The behavior: brush teeth, wash face, and read story. Wash dishes. You can have any sort, they can do either one of those. And then the consequence, they get to pick their rewards. You pick a radio station to fall asleep to, pick your favorite stuffed animal, pick story for tomorrow night. Every place there's a choice in when, what, and reward. You don't have to have choices in each one. A real useful place to have choices is in the rewards. And that's because sometimes rewards are available and sometimes they're not. When you're thinking about your own consequences and your plans and the plans in the future, think about, if I'm going to make this reward accessible when that individual does this behavior, will it always be there? Or will there be circumstances that, with all the best planning, that reward's not going to be there? So if it's like time with somebody, it's a great reward, particularly for children. Time with an individual that they love. But what if that person's called out for work, or what if that person's sick, or what if, maybe have another one. Maybe almost every time the individual is able to fulfill their role in being the reward for someone's behavior, but it would be really nice to have a backup. And maybe the individual every once in a while just wants some alone time, and so the alternative reward is video games, should the first award not be available. And you can manage that too, or you can just say, every time you do this behavior, you can either spend time with this individual or you can spend some time video games, spend some time. Really, really cool way to be. And when we get the individual involved in that and they're selecting these things, they may not know, and it's important that you tell them about this. As they select things, you have to make sure that they understand, first, there's no other way to access these things unless they do the behavior. So if they're going to put something on the line, they got to be willing to understand that their behavior is contingent, that the reward is contingent on their behavior. And so they might not get it. And so it's important to recognize these reinforcers may not be forthcoming if the individual doesn't do the behavior. It also highlights the kinds of things the individual likes to do. So even if you toss some of them and say, I don't want to put video games on the line, or I don't want to put my one-on-one time with my child on the line, I want that no matter what's going on, that should be there. Recognize that that is a reinforcer and it can be used in a different context. It gives you that kind of list. The same is with, maybe we would like our kids to clean their room in the morning, but in a way, does it really matter when? So maybe we can give them some choice there, give them some agency. Maybe they have chores they need to get done, but they have a list of different chores and they have to do one of them a day. How cool would that be? And so those are all ways in which you can incorporate choice into your behavior plans. So we're for this week, we're looking at a discussion. We talk about why making choices is so important when working with people. What happens when we can no longer make choices, and what situations would lead others to make choices for us? And certainly can go back in our history. Just as looking at some of this, I've worked with some elderly when I was working in hospice and working in long-term care and home-based long-term care. Saw situations in which a person's had more and more choices being made for them, and you had to remind people how important it was for individuals to remain in power and control of their own lives. Now, for the quiz, all I want you to do is I want you to take any ABC contingency theory. Probably the best one to use would be the one you're currently working on. We're gonna start working diligently on your special assignment. Consider where choice can happen there. Want to go nuts and create choices all over the place? That's fine. You do not have to necessarily implement your plan with those choices, but you can use your plan to kind of like play around with the idea of adding choices to any one of those components, any combination of them, all three if you want, just like I did in my example. So feel free to do that. At the same time, just re-emphasizing, you don't necessarily have to move the plan in that direction, to put choices in it. Some of you may have plans where if you want it very simplistic, you're after one behavior under certain circumstances, and you're going to have a particular reward, and you think that would be the best method with no choices within the plan. That's fine for the final. Let's play around with it now to give some areas of where potentially you could add choices to the behavior plan that you are looking at. So I'll be looking for that in terms of a quiz answer. So what I want you to be able to, in the quiz, in the writing it out, say, I can see, I can see choices in the antecedents, list those choices with bullet points. I can see choices in the behaviors, list those. I can see choices in the consequences. If you're just to kind of go into some detail, make sure I can see the whole plan. So if you're only going to make choices in the consequences, then give me the A, give me the B, and then show me where the choices are in the consequences. The same with the A and B if you make sure it changes in there. Make sure I understand the context in which this is coming across, and make sure you include that in the answer to that quiz. So we have the discussion about why choice is important, and then we have the quiz where you're going to experiment with your own behavior plan. At least that's the best place to go to do this, to get you working and thinking about your own special assignment, and do that as the quiz. So have a great week. Take much care. Enjoy the weather. And be well. I'll see you online.